I remember the first breath I ever took, not as a memory should be remembered, fragmented, soft-edged, reconstructed from stories told by those who were there, but as an experience. Sharp, immediate, branded into whatever passed for my soul before I had the words to name it. That breath tasted of metal and ozone, of something fundamental in the universe gone wrong, and it thrummed with a vibration that no one else in that filthy birthing chamber seemed to hear. Or perhaps they heard it and had simply learned, over generations of survival beneath the rift, to pretend they didn't. The midwives wrapped me in cloth marked with sigils I would later learn were protective wards, crude approximations of high Gothic prayers stitched by hands that trembled even as they worked. They whispered litanies over my squirming infant form, the words running together into a susurrus of desperate faith. Emperor protect, Emperor guide, Emperor cleanse the taint before it takes root. Their breath was sour with fear and cheap recalf, and even then, newborn, blind, barely conscious, I could feel their terror like a physical presence in the room. They called us Riftborn, though never to our faces, as if naming the condition risked angering the tear in the sky above our settlement. The rift, even as an infant, I sensed it. A presence, a weight, an attention that pressed down on our world like a thumb on a beetle's carapace, testing how much pressure it would take to make the shell crack. They told me later that it had opened 17 years before my birth, a wound in reality itself, spawned when a Gellar field failure in high orbit had torn a warp-capable transport inside out. The ship had screamed as it died, they said, screamed with 1,000 voices that weren't quite human, and when it finally exploded, it left behind something worse than wreckage. It left behind a doorway. The administratum designated our settlement Secundus 7 Tertius after the incident, a bureaucratic renaming that was supposed to distance us from whatever corruption leaked through that cosmic wound. But names are just sounds, and sounds cannot unmake what has been made. The rift remained, a swirling kaleidoscope of colors that had no place in baseline human perception, pulsing in the upper atmosphere like a diseased organ. At night, it cast our hive district in shades of purple and green that made shadows move wrong, that made the rats in the walls grow too large and develop too many teeth, and it changed the children born beneath its gaze. My mother never spoke of my birth, not directly, but I pieced together the truth from overheard conversations, from the way she flinched when I looked at her too directly, from the protective charm she wore in layers around her neck like armor made of superstition. The delivery had been difficult. The midwives had argued about whether to let me live or to show mercy, while I was still small enough for mercy to be an option. In the end, my father, a man I barely remember beyond the smell of promethium and industrial lubricant, had threatened them with violence if they harmed me. He regretted that decision before I was 6 months old. By the time I could walk, I had already learned the first and most important lesson of life as a Riftborn. Hide. Hide what you feel. Hide what you see. Hide the moments when reality stutters like a damaged picked feed and you glimpse things that exist in the spaces between atoms. The adults called them episodes, speaking in hushed voices about the children who had too many, who couldn't suppress the symptoms, who one day simply stopped being children and became something else wearing a child's skin. I was 3 the first time it happened to me. We were in the communal eating hall, a vast echoing space carved from the hive's lower levels, where the air was thick with the smell of recycled protein paste and the constant background hum of failing ventilation systems. Hundreds of people packed together, eating their rationed meals in the mechanical silence of exhausted workers. I remember sitting beside my mother, trying to choke down the grey sludge that served as breakfast, when suddenly the colours bled. That's the only way I can describe it. The world's colours ran together like wet paint, and beneath the mundane reality of concrete and steel, I saw something else. Geometric patterns that hurt to perceive, angles that pointed in directions that didn't exist, and threading through it all singing. Voices without mouths, humming my name in harmonies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I must have made a sound, because my mother's hand clamped over my mouth with bruising force. "Don't," she hissed into my ear, her voice cracking with barely controlled panic. "Don't react, don't let them see." The episode passed after a few seconds or hours. Time moved strangely when the rift flexed, and the world snapped back into its normal configuration. Across the hall, A servo skull doing routine patrols swept past us without pausing, its dead eyes recording nothing unusual, but I felt my mother shaking beside me for the rest of the meal, and that night I heard her weeping in the other room while my father tried uselessly to comfort her. "He's just a child," she sobbed. "He's just a child." But we both knew I wasn't. Not really. Not anymore. The Riftborn developed patterns, commonalities that the settlement's population learned to recognize, even as they pretended not to notice. We were too quiet as infants, our eyes tracking movements no one else could see. We startled at sounds that didn't exist in the audible spectrum. We drew pictures in the dust that made adults uncomfortable, spirals within spirals, sigils we couldn't possibly have learned, faces with too many features arranged in configurations that suggested intelligence but not humanity. Some of us were worse than others. There was a girl in my hab block, Lisa, who could predict when the rift would pulse. She would start screaming exactly 3 hours before each surge, her voice taking on a harmonic quality that made windows vibrate and dogs howl. By the time she was 4, her parents had gagged her permanently, and she communicated only through frantic gestures that no one wanted to interpret too closely. There was a boy, Maxim, whose shadow didn't always match his movements. Sometimes it would linger when he walked away, or stretch in directions the light source couldn't account for. The priests who occasionally visited our district made the sign of the Aquila whenever he passed, their lips moving in silent prayers of protection. And there was me. I learned early that my particular curse was subtler than most, which meant I had a better chance of survival, but also that I had to be more careful, because while Lisa's screaming and Maxim's shadow wrongness were obvious, my affliction could be mistaken for something else. For intuition, for cleverness, for witchcraft. I could hear the rift singing, not always, not constantly. But when it pulsed, when the tear in reality flexed and expanded like a wound trying to breathe, I could hear it, a chorus of voices speaking in languages I didn't know but somehow understood. They told me things, secret things, true things. They showed me glimpses of other places, worlds where the sky was a different color, where humans had too many limbs or no limbs at all, where cities grew like coral and sang psalms to gods, with names that tasted like copper on my tongue. I never told anyone, not my mother, who was already fracturing under the weight of having birthed something tainted, not my father, who had stopped looking at me directly after I turned 2, not the teachers in the mandatory scholar program who taught us catechisms and calculations while carefully avoiding any mention of what we all lived beneath. I kept the voices secret, buried deep in the same place where normal children kept their imaginary friends and fears of the dark. And in that secret place, I began to suspect something terrible. The rift wasn't just watching us, it was waiting. The Administrator Medicae arrived when I was 7, and with them came the certainty that childhood, whatever fragile pretense of it we Riftborn had been allowed, was officially over. They came in a convoy of 3 Chimera transports, their armor plating painted in the dull grey-green of Imperial bureaucracy, accompanied by pallid clerks whose skin had the translucent quality of people who lived their entire lives under artificial light. Servo skulls jittered in their wake, cybernetic abominations that had once been human heads, now reduced to flying recording devices that swept back and forth with insectile precision, their dead eyes capturing everything for archives that would never be read by anyone who cared. The official notification had come 3 days prior, delivered by a sweating Arbeits officer who wouldn't step fully inside our HAB unit, as if proximity to our living space might contaminate him. The parchment he handed my father was covered in official seals and high Gothic text, but the message was simple enough even for illiterates to understand. Compliance mandatory, failure to appear subject to immediate arbitration. Everyone knew what arbitration meant in a settlement like ours. A last round to the back of the head and a corpse chute disposal. They're here to assess potential liabilities, my father said that night, his voice hollow as he stared at the notification, his hands massive. Scarred things built for factory work trembled as they held the parchment. That's what it says. Assessment of potential liabilities to Imperial productivity and security. My mother said nothing. She had stopped speaking much after my 4th birthday, when I'd told her with the innocent cruelty only children possess that I could see the thing living behind her eyes, the thing that whispered to her at night. The thing that was slowly teaching her that the floor of our hab unit was actually a very thin membrane stretched over an infinite abyss, and that one day it would tear. She had started sleeping with her back wedged into a corner after that, and the screaming only happened on nights when the rift pulsed. The testing facility was a converted warehouse in Secundus 7's industrial quarter, its interior stripped of machinery and replaced with examination stations that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd studied Medicae procedures and torture chambers in equal measure. Cold. Sterile. Deliberately dehumanizing in the way only Imperial institutions could achieve. We were processed in groups of 20. I remember standing in line with the other Rift-born children, all of us marked by the same telltale signs, two quiet demeanors, eyes that tracked things no one else could see, the unconscious habit of flinching when the rift pulsed overhead, even though the warehouse ceiling blocked any direct view of it. Some of the younger ones cried, their wails echoing off the metal walls. Others had gone somewhere else inside their heads, their faces slack, bodies present but minds retreated to wherever we went when reality became too sharp-edged to bear. A boy 2 places ahead of me in line, I think his name was Petir, though names became slippery, things in that place started laughing, not the high, nervous giggle of fear, but deep, genuine amusement that came from somewhere inhuman. His head tilted at an angle necks shouldn't achieve, and his laughter took on harmonics that made the servo skulls overhead spin in confused circles, trying to identify the source of the sound distortion. 2 orderlies in hazmat suits dragged him out of line. We never saw him again. When my turn came, they strapped me into a machine that looked like a Medicae gurney had mated with an inquisitorial interrogation chair and produced something that combined the worst qualities of both. Cold metal pressed against my spine, my wrists, my temples, cables thick as my forearm connected to ports in the machine's base. And I could hear something humming beneath the floor, a generator, or perhaps something worse, something that drew power from sources the Mechanicus preferred not to discuss in polite company. Subject 7739, a tech priest intoned, his voice modulated through a voxcaster that stripped away any human warmth. Half his face was gone, replaced by augmetic sensors that clicked and whirred as they focused on me. Age: 7 standard years. Designation: Riftborn, 3rd generation proximity. Preliminary psychic index. Pending evaluation. The word psychic hung in the air like an executioner's blade. I'm not, I started to say, but the machine activated before I could finish the lie. Pain. Not physical pain, though that would have been preferable. This was something else. The machine reached inside my head with invisible fingers and started pulling, dragging out thoughts and memories, and the secret places where I'd hidden the voices. I felt it hook into the part of me that heard the rift singing, the part I'd spent 7 years learning to suppress and deny, and it yanked that part into the light where clinical sensors could measure and catalog it. I screamed. Everyone screamed during the tests. The lucky ones stopped after a few minutes. The unlucky ones screamed until their throats tore, until blood vessels burst in their eyes, until the orderlies had to inject them with sedatives strong enough to kill a grown man. I fell somewhere in the middle. When the machine finally released me, I tasted copper and smelled burned hair my own. I realized distantly where the temple contacts had heated up during the extraction process. My vision swam, overlaying the sterile examination room with ghostly after-images of other places. Vast cyclopean cities built by hands with too many fingers, oceans made of something that moved like water but screamed like the dying. Skies filled with geometry that violated every principle of Euclidean space. Results logged, the tech priest said, and I heard something in his mechanical voice that might have been satisfaction or might have been disgust. It was hard to tell with so much of his humanity surgically excised. Subject exhibits theta-grade resonance with local warp phenomenon. Psychic potential rated at epsilon-. Risk assessment elevated. Recommendation: continued monitoring with potential future intervention. He reached forward with a mechadendrite, a serpentine mechanical limb that emerged from his spine, and pressed something cold against my neck. I felt a sharp sting, and then a numbness that spread from the injection site. Tracking marker implanted, he said. You are now property of the Administratum Psychana Census Bureau. Failure to report for scheduled evaluations will result in immediate retrieval and sanctioning. They unstrapped me and pushed me toward a recovery area where other tested children sat on metal benches, staring at nothing. Some rocked back and forth. Others picked at their skin with mechanical repetition, as if trying to claw their way out of their own bodies. A girl approximately my age sat perfectly still, tears streaming down her face in silence, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been the beginning of a possession. I found an empty space on a bench and sat. The tests continued for 3 days. Each morning, they would call a group of us forward for additional evaluations. Some were purely physical genetic sequencing, blood typing, skeletal density measurements designed to detect mutation before it became visible. Others were psychological Rorschach patterns that moved, word association games where the words were in languages we shouldn't know, dream analysis that required us to describe nightmares we were still living. And then there were the tests no one talked about, the ones conducted in sealed chambers by evaluators who wore hexagrammic wards and carried bolt pistols loaded with blessed ammunition. The ones where children went in and sometimes didn't come out. When they did emerge, they were different, hollow, scraped clean of whatever had made them individuals, reduced to biological shells that ate and slept and responded to commands but no longer had anything behind their eyes that could be called human. On the second day, they called Lissa the screaming girl from my hab block. She had been quiet during the testing, the gag in her mouth reducing her prophecies to muffled moans. When they removed it for her evaluation, she didn't scream. She smiled, a terrible knowing smile that showed too many teeth, and she spoke in a voice that wasn't hers. The wound will birth itself through your children's children, and the new gods will feast on the marrow of your faith. They shot her, not with a lass weapon too quick, too clean. They used an archaic stub pistol loaded with blessed rounds that had been inscribed with prayers to the Emperor. Each shot was deliberate, methodical, and Lissa, or the thing wearing Lissa, laughed until her lungs filled with blood, and the laughter became wet, gurgling. They burned the body in an incinerator we could all hear roaring in the adjacent chamber. No one spoke of it, not officially. But that night, in the dormitory where they kept us between testing sessions, every rift-born child understood the fundamental equation of our existence. We were not being evaluated to see if we could be saved. We were being evaluated to determine the most efficient method of our disposal. On the third day, they gave us our results. Mine came in the form of a data slate pressed into my hands by a clerk who wouldn't look at me. The screen displayed my designation, Subject 7739, along with a dense wall of technical jargon I couldn't fully parse, but certain phrases jumped out, burned themselves into my memory. Warp resonance, persistent. Corruption vector, dormant but viable. Psychic potential, low grade but measurable. Risk assessment, elevated. Recommendation, monitoring protocol Sigma. Mandatory monthly evaluations, potential future sanctioning pending development trajectory. At the bottom, stamped in red that looked too much like blood, was a single word, tainted. They released us back to our families with tracking implants in our necks and files that would follow us forever. We were marked now, officially and irrevocably. The Imperium knew what we were, and it was watching, waiting to see which of us would break first, which of us would become the thing the Rift had been trying to make us since birth. As I walked home through streets that felt different now, sharper, more hostile, as if the settlement itself had learned to fear me, I felt the Rift pulse overhead, and for the first time, I felt it pulse back through the tracking implant in my neck. They had marked me to monitor the taint, but in doing so, they had also created a connection, a thread, a way for the voices to find me even when I wasn't listening. That night, I dreamed of drowning in color, and when I woke, my results were stamped with too many red seals, and I understood what every Riftborn eventually learned. Survival was not a possibility. Only the manner of our ending remained to be determined. Puberty twisted us in ways normal medicine couldn't explain. I was 12 when my body began its transformation, not just the standard metamorphosis that afflicts every human child, the awkward shifting of bones and hormones that marks the passage from childhood to something approximating adulthood. No, for the Riftborn, puberty was something else entirely. It was the moment when whatever seeds the warp had planted in us during our development finally took root and began to grow. The Administratum Medicae had warned our parents, in their clinical, emotionless way, that adolescence would be a period of elevated risk for manifestation events. They said it like they were discussing crop yields or manufacturing quotas, reducing the horror of our existence to numbers on a data slate. They increased our mandatory evaluation frequency to twice monthly, and the tracking implants in our necks were upgraded to newer models that pulsed more insistently whenever the rift overhead flexed. What they didn't tell us, what they couldn't tell us, because the Imperium's understanding of the warp was fundamentally limited by its refusal to truly study what it feared was that the changes would be personal, specific, tailored to something deep in our individual psychologies, as if the rift had been watching each of us since birth and had decided exactly what kind of monster we were meant to become. For some of us, the gifts were sensory. Mikhail, a boy from the lower Hab blocks, developed eyes that could see too much. Not just visible light, but the electromagnetic spectrum in its entirety, radiation, heat signatures, the invisible web of Vox traffic, and Auspex signals that webbed through the hive like digital nerves. He started wearing a blindfold after he looked at a crowd and saw everyone as overlapping skeletons wrapped in pulsing organs, their thoughts manifesting as colored auras that shifted with their emotions. He lasted 3 months before he clawed his own eyes out in a fit of sensory overload, screaming about too many frequencies, too many signals, can't filter, can't stop seeing. They took him away after that. We never learned what happened to him, but sometimes at night I thought I could hear his screams echoing through the vents, as if they'd stored him somewhere in the hive's depths where the damaged Riftborn were kept for study. For Yevina, it was touch. She could feel emotions through physical contact, not metaphorically, but literally, as if human feelings had texture and temperature. Anger was hot and jagged. Fear was cold and slippery. Love, which was rare in our settlement, felt like warm honey, thick and cloying. She stopped touching people entirely after she accidentally brushed against a man contemplating suicide and felt the exact shape of his despair, a void so profound it left her catatonic for 3 days. And then there was me. My gift was the cruelest, because it was the most subtle, the hardest to hide, and the most likely to get me burned as a witch if anyone fully understood what was happening. I could feel emotions radiating from crowds like waves of heat. Not individual thoughts. I wasn't a true telepath. Thank the absent emperor for that small mercy. But the emotional tone of groups, the collective psychic impression of dozens or hundreds of people in proximity, hit me like atmospheric pressure. A crowd of angry workers felt like standing too close to a furnace. A gathering of frightened refugees was a cold wind that made my bones ache. The mandatory imperial prayer sessions, where thousands gathered to recite catechisms they didn't believe to a god-emperor who never answered, created a suffocating blanket of desperation and hollow faith that left me gasping. The first time it truly manifested, I was in the communal district during a food distribution. Hundreds of people packed into a space designed for half that number, all of them hungry, exhausted, pushed to the edge of violence by lives that ground them down like meat in a processor. The emotional pressure built and built, rage and fear and desperation creating a psychic feedback loop, and suddenly I could feel it all. Every frustrated thought, every suppressed scream, every moment of barely controlled violence. It hit me like a physical blow, and I went to my knees in the middle of the crowd, hands pressed against my temples, trying desperately not to scream because screaming would draw attention, and attention meant examination, and examination meant they would discover what I could do, and then, "Get up." My father's voice, harsh with fear disguised as anger. His hand on my arm, pulling me upright with bruising force, dragging me out of the crowd while I struggled to breathe through the emotional pressure crushing my chest. We made it 3 blocks before I vomited in an alley. My body's rebellion against stimuli it wasn't designed to process. "You need to control it," my father hissed, his eyes scanning the street for witnesses. A priest walked past, and my father immediately straightened, making the sign of the Aquila with shaking hands. The priest's gaze lingered on us for a moment, and I felt his emotion too, a mix of suspicion and disgust that tasted like ashes before he continued on his rounds. "I'm trying," I managed through gritted teeth. "I don't know how." "Then learn." His grip on my arm tightened. "Learn, or you die. It's that simple." But it wasn't simple. Nothing about being Riftborn was simple. I tried meditation techniques stolen from prohibited texts in the Scholar library. I tried prayer, though I suspected the Emperor wasn't listening to something like me. I tried alcohol, stolen from my father's hidden supply, which only made the emotions louder and more colorful. Nothing worked. The gift curse, mutation, whatever name you gave it, was a part of me now, woven into my nervous system as fundamentally as pain receptors or the ability to taste. The only thing that helped was distance. I started avoiding crowds, taking the long routes through empty corridors, even when it meant being late for work assignments. I volunteered for maintenance shifts in the settlement's outer sectors, where the population density was lower and the emotional pressure didn't build to crushing levels. I became a ghost in my own life, present but never truly participating, watching humanity from behind a barrier of psychic static that I couldn't turn off. The local priests noticed. Father Gregorius, an ancient man whose face was more scar tissue than flesh, rumored to have fought in some campaign against heretics decades ago, started appearing wherever I went. Not following me, exactly, just present. Watching. His pale eyes tracked me during prayer sessions, and I could feel his emotion pressing against my senses, suspicion mixed with something that might have been pity or might have been the satisfaction of a hunter who's found his prey's trail. "You carry something," he said to me one day, his voice like gravel being ground underfoot. We were alone in one of the settlement's chapel shrines, surrounded by icons of the Emperor that looked down with accusing eyes. "I can see it in the way you move, the way you avoid human contact, the way you flinch when the faithful gather." My mouth went dry. "I don't know what you mean, Father. Don't lie to a servant of the Emperor, child." He stepped closer, and the scent of incense and old sweat rolled off him in waves. His emotion was complex suspicion, yes, but also curiosity and something that felt disturbingly like hunger. "The rift marks all of you, some more visibly than others. I've spent 20 years in this damned settlement, and I know the signs. The question is not whether you're tainted, we all know you are. The question is whether the taint can be contained, or whether it must be excised." He let that word hang in the air between us, sharp as a blade. "I'm loyal to the Emperor," I said, the ritual words automatic. "I serve the Imperium." "You're an abomination." His words were flat, factual, without malice. Somehow that made them worse. Not by choice, I grant you, but biology doesn't care about intentions. The warp has touched you, and that touch spreads like a disease if left unchecked. He reached out and pressed one gnarled finger against my forehead, right between my eyes, and I felt his emotions slam into me with focused intensity, testing me, probing, trying to feel what I felt. I jerked back, and the sudden movement was a mistake because it confirmed everything he suspected. Father Gregorius smiled. It was not a kind expression. "I thought so," he said softly. "You're sensitive, not just to the warp itself, but to the emanations of living minds. Empathic resonance, the Ordo Hereticus calls it, a minor talent, but one that grows with time if not properly sanctioned." "Please," I whispered, and hated myself for the weakness in my voice. "Please, I haven't hurt anyone. I don't listen on purpose. I can't help." "I know." He sighed, and for a moment he looked infinitely tired. "That's what makes this difficult. You're not malicious, child. You're just wrong, a mistake. A reminder that humanity builds its settlements too close to things that should never be approached." He turned away, his robes rustling. At the chapel door, he paused. "I haven't reported you yet," he said, without looking back. "Perhaps I should, perhaps it would be merciful, but I want to see what happens, whether you'll master this curse or let it master you. The Emperor tests us all, child, and some tests are simply to see how long we can endure before we break." He left, and I stood alone in the chapel, surrounded by icons that felt like they were judging me, and I realized something terrible. He was right. The gift was growing. Every day, it became harder to filter out the emotional noise. Every crowd felt louder. Every gathering of frightened, desperate humans pressed more insistently against my mind, and underneath it all, constant and insidious, I could feel the rift itself, its vast, incomprehensible attention focused on our settlement like a magnifying glass focusing sunlight on insects. It was waiting for something, and then, one night, it happened. The rift flared brighter than a false dawn, and the entire settlement shook with a soundless concussion that existed more in the mind than in physical space. Alarms shrieked, voxcasters blared warnings about atmospheric disturbances and potential warp intrusion events. People ran through the streets in panic, and their terror hit me like a tidal wave of ice water and broken glass. I felt 4 presences vanish. Not dying had a signature, a final spike of fear and pain and desperate resistance. This was different. These 4 consciousnesses, children from my hab block, rift-born like me, simply stopped existing in the physical world. One moment they were there, their emotions part of the background radiation of human presence. The next moment they were gone, leaving behind holes in reality that hurt to perceive. No screams. No struggle. Just absence. The adults insisted it was a structural collapse, a hab unit failure, a tragic but explainable accident in a settlement held together by hope and corroded metal. They found bodies eventually, or things that looked enough like bodies for identification purposes, and held the proper imperial funeral rites, complete with prayers for the emperor to guide the departed souls to his side. But I knew better. Even as a child, even as a cursed, broken thing that could feel emotions like radiation, I knew better. I could still sense them, faintly, like ghost signals coming from somewhere that wasn't a place. They weren't dead. They had been taken, pulled through the membrane of reality into whatever churned on the other side of the rift, and they were screaming, silently, endlessly, in a place where sound didn't work the way it should. From that night forward, I slept with my back to the wall, paralyzed by the certainty that if I closed my eyes too deeply, if I let my consciousness drift too far into sleep's void, something would reach through and drag me after them. The gift had become a curse, and the curse was teaching me that survival and sanity were mutually exclusive options. When the Inquisition finally came, they did not arrive as saviors but as sweepers of a problem left to rot too long. I was 15 years old, though age had become a strange, fluid concept in a settlement where time itself seemed to move irregularly, as if the rift's presence distorted more than just space. 15 years of hiding what I was. 15 years of feeling every desperate emotion that radiated from the dying settlement around me. 15 years of watching other riftborn vanish or break or transform into things that had to be put down like rabid animals. 15 years of waiting for this moment. They announced their arrival 3 days in advance, which was a courtesy the Inquisition rarely extended. Or perhaps it wasn't courtesy at all. Perhaps they wanted us to marinate in our fear, wanted the terror to build until the settlement's emotional atmosphere was so saturated with dread that even normal humans could taste it. I felt it building like atmospheric pressure before a storm. The voxcasters throughout Secunda 7 crackled to life with the official proclamation, read in the flat, affectless tone that characterized all imperial bureaucratic communications. By order of the Ordo Hereticus, all residents of settlement Secunda 7 Tertius are hereby notified of mandatory compliance screenings to be conducted over a period of 7 standard days. Failure to attend scheduled screening will be considered evidence of heretical contamination and will result in summary execution. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. That phrase had become a sick joke in our settlement. If the Emperor protected, why had he allowed the rift to open? If he protected, why were children born with their souls half drowned in warp corruption? If he protected, why did we live every day knowing that our existence was temporary, provisional, subject to cancellation the moment we became more trouble than we were worth? But you didn't say these things aloud, not if you wanted to keep your tongue. The Inquisition's fleet descended on the 3rd day, 3 bulk transporters and a strike cruiser that hung in low orbit like a sword held over our heads. They brought soldiers, stormtroopers in carapace armor, their faces hidden behind rebreather masks, their weapons held with the casual readiness of people who killed often and efficiently. They brought priests, dour men and women in black robes covered with purity seals, clutching holy texts and auspex units that measured spiritual corruption the way a thermometer measured fever. And they brought him, Inquisitor Voke. I never learned his first name if he had one. He'd long since abandoned it in favor of his title and function. He was a tall man, cadaverously thin, with skin the color of old parchment and eyes that reflected nothing. Not cold eyes, exactly, Just empty. As if whatever humanity had once existed behind them had been systematically excised in favor of pure, focused purpose. He wore the inquisitorial rosette openly on his chest, the symbol of absolute authority in the Emperor's name. Around his neck hung a dozen purity seals, and his hands long-fingered, almost delicate ball rings, inscribed with hexagrammic wards that made my teeth ache to look at. When I felt his emotional signature, it was like touching ice that burned. There was no rage in him, no hatred, no sadistic pleasure in what he was about to do, just certainty. The absolute, unshakable conviction that what he was doing was necessary, righteous, and would be completed regardless of how many lives it consumed. It was the most terrifying emotion I had ever felt. They set up their screening center in the settlement's main plaza, the same place where we'd once gathered for food distributions and imperial holidays. Now it was transformed into something between a medical facility and an execution ground. Processing stations lined the perimeter, each staffed by tech priests whose augmetic implants clicked and whirred as they recorded data. In the center stood a massive device I didn't recognize, a towering structure of brass and corroded iron, covered in religious iconography and pulsing with a sickly green light that made the air around it taste of ozone and fear. Psychic resonance detector, my father whispered as we stood in the line that snaked through the plaza. His hand was on my shoulder, gripping hard enough to hurt. Old Mechanicus design. It measures, I don't know, warp taint, soul corruption, whatever the hell they call it. I could feel the device even from a distance, a pulling sensation, like it was trying to drag something out of me. Around us, the other Riftborn shifted uncomfortably, their faces pale, their emotions broadcasting pure terror that slammed into my empathic sense like waves against a seawall. We were gathered in the square, and the sight was obscene in its organization. Hundreds of us, the Riftborn, marked by our tracking implants and the red stamps in our administratum files, separated from the normal population like diseased cattle. Our names had already been replaced with numbers, printed on armbands they'd forced us to wear. I was 7,739. I had been that number since the testing 5 years ago, but now it was the only identifier that mattered. Our worth was being measured in threat potential. The screenings began at dawn. One by one, they called us forward. Some went willingly, their heads bowed in acceptance. Others had to be dragged by stormtroopers, their screams echoing across the plaza until a rifle butt to the head silenced them. A few tried to run, which was pointless. The settlement was sealed, every exit guarded, every corridor monitored. Those who ran were shot in the back, their bodies left where they fell as object lessons in the futility of resistance. When they called my number, my father's hand tightened on my shoulder one last time. "Remember," he said, his voice thick, "you are loyal, you are faithful, you are Subject 7739. A stormtrooper's modulated voice cut through my father's words. "Proceed to Station 12 for processing." I walked forward on legs that didn't feel like mine, through a corridor of armed soldiers whose emotional signatures were disciplined blanks trained out of them, or perhaps surgically removed, along with any capacity for doubt or mercy. The other Riftborn watched me pass, their faces mirrors of my own fear, and I felt their emotions pressing against my mind, terror and resignation, and a terrible, bitter acceptance that this had always been inevitable. Station 12 was a simple setup, a chair, a tech priest, a data slate, and Inquisitor Voke himself, standing like a black pillar of judgment. "Sit," the tech priest said, and I sat. Cold sensors pressed against my temples. A needle slid into my arm, drawing blood for genetic analysis. The tech priest's augmetic eyes scanned me with inhuman precision, recording every twitch, every breath, every micro-expression that might indicate corruption or deceit. "Subject 7739, Voke said, his voice soft, almost gentle. 15 standard years, 3rd generation Riftborn. Previous evaluation flagged for theta-grade warp resonance and empathic sensitivity." He glanced at his data slate. "You've been compliant with mandatory evaluations. No documented manifestation events. No reports of aberrant behavior." He looked up, and his empty eyes focused on me with the weight of absolute attention. "Tell me," he said, "do you hear voices?" The question was a trap. Deny it, and the psychic resonance detector would reveal the lie. Admit it, and I was confessing to corruption that warranted immediate execution. I felt his emotion or lack of it pressing against me, a void that somehow had texture and weight. Sometimes, I said, choosing honesty because lies were impossible here. When the rift pulses, I hear singing, in languages I don't know, but I don't listen. I never listen. But you can listen. Not a question. A statement. Yes. And you feel emotions. From others. From crowds. Yes. Do you manipulate those emotions, amplify fear, suppress loyalty? No. The word burst out before I could stop it. No, I just feel them. I can't control it. I can't turn it off, but I don't do anything with it. I swear on the Emperor's name. The Emperor's name means nothing in the mouth of the tainted. The words were delivered without inflection, a simple statement of theological fact, and they hit me harder than any physical blow. Voke turned to the tech priest. Analysis? The tech priest's mechadendrites twitched as he processed the data flowing from the sensors. Psychic potential confirmed, empathic resonance active, warp exposure elevated but stable, no active corruption detected at this time. However, he paused, and even through his mechanical voice modulation, I heard something that might have been uncertainty. Subject's psychic signature is irregular. There are harmonic frequencies that suggest potential for escalation. Given environmental factors and documented instability in similar cases, recommendation is sanction. Voke finished. The word dropped into the space between us like a stone into still water. Please. My voice cracked. Please. I haven't done anything. I'm loyal. I serve the Imperium. You are a liability. Voke leaned forward, and I saw something flicker in his empty eyes. Not compassion, but perhaps a distant cousin of it. Acknowledgement, maybe. Understanding that what he was about to do was monstrous, even if it was necessary. Not by choice, not by action, but by existence. The rift has marked you, and that mark spreads. We've observed the pattern in settlements like this. The taint compounds across generations, each cohort more unstable than the last, until something catastrophic occurs. We are here to prevent that catastrophe. By killing us. By culling the infected before they become infectious. Around the plaza, I heard screams beginning. Other stations reaching their verdicts. Stormtroopers moving with mechanical efficiency, separating those deemed salvageable from those designated for immediate termination. I felt the terror spike across hundreds of minds simultaneously, a psychic shriek that made my vision blur and my hands shake. And in that moment, I felt it. The rift. It pulsed, responding to the collective fear and desperation radiating from its children. I felt it stretch. Felt reality grow thin like worn fabric. Felt something on the other side pressing against the membrane between dimensions with intelligence and hunger and terrible, focused purpose. Voke felt it too. His head snapped upward, and for the first time, emotion flickered across his face. Alarm. It's responding, he said to the tech priest. The mass emotional discharge is creating resonance. We need to accelerate the screaming started in earnest then. Not from the Riftborn being executed. We had learned long ago that screaming only made it worse. No. This was different. This was the sound of reality itself screaming as something forced its way through from the other side. 3 Riftborn children younger than me, huddled together near Station 4, suddenly changed. Their skin split like overripe fruit, and something that had been growing inside them emerged, writhing masses of impossible geometry, mouths that spoke in backward syllables, eyes that looked in directions that violated 3-dimensional space. The stormtroopers opened fire immediately, their lasguns burning into the transforming bodies with practiced precision. But it was too late. The things that had been children were fully manifested now, demonic entities that the rift had been incubating for years, waiting for the exact right moment of collective terror to complete their birth. Chaos erupted. More Riftborn began transforming. Some fought it, their faces contorted in agony as they tried to resist the change burning through their bodies. Others surrendered to it, their expressions shifting from fear to ecstasy as they let the corruption consume them fully. The inquisitorial forces responded with brutal efficiency, flamers washing over the infected, bolter rounds exploding corrupted flesh, power weapons carving through entities that had never been fully human. And Inquisitor Voke stood at the center of it all, his empty eyes surveying the carnage with the detachment of a surgeon cutting away diseased tissue. In the confusion, I ran. Not away, there was nowhere to go, no escape from a sealed settlement surrounded by inquisitorial soldiers, but toward the outer corridors where fewer people gathered, toward the spaces between, where my empathic sense wasn't drowning in the psychic screaming of mass death. I found a forgotten maintenance alcove in sub-level 23, a space barely large enough for one person, filled with decaying machinery and the smell of rust and despair. I wedged myself into the darkness and pulled out the small data slate I'd stolen months ago, preparing for this exact moment. My hands shook as I began to record. My name was... No, that wasn't right. Names didn't matter anymore. I was Subject 7739. I was born beneath a wound in reality. I survived 15 years as a mistake the universe was trying to correct. And now, as I record these last thoughts in a forgotten corner of the hab, I can feel the rift pulsing again, welcoming me home in its own terrible way. I don't know if anyone will find this. I don't know if it matters. But I want someone to know that we existed, that we tried, that we were human, even when the universe insisted we weren't. That we were children once, before we became problems to be solved. Above me, I heard the sound of systematic slaughter. Lust fire and screaming and the harsh chanting of priests performing emergency exorcism rites. I felt the emotional landscape of my settlement, my home, burning like a forest fire, consuming everything and everyone I'd ever known. And beneath it all, constant and patient and inevitable, I felt the rift singing. It had always been singing. I had just finally learned to hear it clearly. The tracking implant in my neck pulsed once, twice, and I knew they were triangulating my position. The stormtroopers would find me soon. Minutes, maybe, perhaps less. I looked at my hands, still human, still my own, and wondered how long that would last. The Emperor protects, the priests always said. But in the darkness of my hiding place, listening to my people die, feeling the rift's attention focus on me like a burning lens, I finally understood the truth. The Emperor wasn't protecting us from the warp. He was protecting the Imperium from us. And we, the Riftborn, the tainted, the cursed, had always been expendable. I heard boots in the corridor. Stormtroopers, moving with mechanical precision, their Auspex units pinging as they tracked the signal from my implant. I closed my eyes. The rift pulsed, and for the first time in my life, I stopped fighting what I was and simply let it in. The colors came first, impossible shades that existed beyond the spectrum of human perception. Then the voices, no longer distant but immediate, pressing against my consciousness with offers of power and transformation and escape from the meat prison of my failing human form. I could surrender. I could let it take me. I could become something that didn't hurt, didn't feel, didn't bear the crushing weight of existence as a cosmic mistake. The door exploded inward. Target acquired, a modulated voice announced. I opened my eyes and they were glowing now, I knew, with that telltale purple luminescence that marked the damned. Inquisitor Voke stepped through the doorway, bolt pistol raised, his empty eyes meeting mine with absolute certainty. Subject 7739, he said quietly, you are found guilty of corruption beyond redemption. The Emperor's mercy is swift. I felt his finger tighten on the trigger, and in that final moment, suspended between life and whatever came after, I felt something I'd never felt before from any human being. Sorrow. Not from Voke, he was still a void, still empty of everything but purpose. From myself. Sorrow for the life I never got to live. For the person I might have been if I'd been born under normal stars. For all the Riftborn children who had done nothing wrong except exist. I'm sorry, I whispered, though I didn't know who I was apologizing to. The bolt pistol fired. The round took me in the chest, and data corruption detected. Final entry timestamp 347. M41. Subject status terminated. Settlement Secundus 7 Tertius. Purged. Survivors 0. The Emperor protects.